They said the rusted clover hadn't made a sound in 7 years, not since the fire that took the sheriff's daughter and half the soul of this town. But last night, as thunder rolled over Absolution, someone played her song again, note for note, from a piano no one dared touch. The sheriff stepped inside, alone. No lights, no tracks. Just one key pressing itself again and again until it stopped. And upstairs, behind a locked door, something started breathing. The storm had rolled in without warning. An uninvited drifter, just like the ones who used to ride through this dying town before it went quiet. Lightning flashed behind the low hills, casting long, crooked shadows across the empty main street of Absolution. Before we go deeper into the truth behind the piano, playing in the abandoned saloon, and the soldier the town tried to forget, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories history tried to bury. Every subscription keeps this journey going and lets us bring more voices out of the silence. It's a small click for you, but it means the world to us. Thank you. The rain hadn't started yet, but the wind carried grit sharp enough to sting the eyes and sand the paint off a coffin. Sheriff Jim Hale moved through the darkness with slow, deliberate steps. He wore his hat pulled low, duster flapping behind him like the trailing hem of a burial shroud. His boots thudded heavy against the warped boards of the boardwalk as he passed shuttered stores and half-toppled signs. Absolution didn't sleep because there weren't enough people left to dream. It just waited. Then it came again. That sound. Low, hollow, a single piano key, struck like a question. Jim stopped. The wind carried it again, another note, 2 this time, spaced apart. Thoughtful, even. From the saloon, the rusted clover. Long since abandoned, its doors chained shut, windows boarded, paint flaked off like scabbed skin. No one's touched that piano in 7 years. He turned slowly toward it, pulse slow but heavy in his neck. That building had ghosts, real ones, or at least the kind that don't need chains to rattle. Thunder cracked, and he used it to move, crossing the street, boots sinking a little in the rain-softened dust. He unsnapped the strap on his holster. 3 more notes. This time, forming a shape, a melody. Uneven, wrong, like someone remembering how to play after forgetting why. He reached the saloon steps. The chain on the front doors had been broken clean through. A rusted link swung gently in the wind. Not cut, forced. Bent outward like someone or something had been inside and wanted out. Jim stepped over the threshold. The air inside was thick with old whiskey and dry rot. His boots echoed on the floorboards, the sound too loud in the silence. The bar was coated in years of dust, tables overturned, glasses untouched since the fire. And there it stood, against the far wall, lit by lightning through the cracks in the boards, the upright piano. Mahogany, keys yellowed. One of them, middle C, still moving. Just barely. As if it had been pressed a moment ago. As if it wanted to be pressed again. He drew his revolver, barrel glinting in a sudden burst of white light. "Who's upstairs?" he called out, voice sharp but not loud. He didn't want to wake anything he couldn't put back to sleep. Silence. He took a step forward, eyes on the staircase curling up behind the bar. Lightning again. The shape of someone at the top, just for a blink, gone before he could breathe. Gone like a whisper that changes your life. Then the music stopped, all at once. Not with a final note, but as if a hand had been yanked away. And for the first time in years, Sheriff Hale's hand trembled against the grip of his gun. 3 days earlier, the sun had been high and merciless, bleaching the town's bones with its usual indifference. Absolution baked quietly under the weight of its own forgetting, its streets near empty, its people thinned by drought, by railroads that went elsewhere, and by history that left bruises instead of records. Sheriff Jim Hale stood in the graveyard behind the chapel, coat off, sleeves rolled, hat held to his chest. He wasn't a praying man, not anymore. But he stood in silence while the preacher read words he'd memorized long ago and no longer believed. The grave was shallow, wood was scarce now, and the pine box simpler than most. The woman inside had no kin left, just a name carved onto the lid by Jim's own knife, Elena Kerr. Widow of the drifter who'd once saved Jim's life out past the Devil's Stare, long before this town had earned its name. When the dust settled and the final prayer was cast like a feather on dry wind, Preacher Ellis turned to him, tired-eyed and honest. "Let it go, Jim," he said, voice low and even. "That Saloon died with her." Jim looked up at the old man, jaw set but quiet. "That's the second funeral I've stood through this week, Ellis. Both had empty chairs that shouldn't have been empty." "And what's that got to do with the clover?" Ellis asked, eyes narrowing. Jim didn't answer, not directly. He watched as a few townsfolk drifted away, hats nodding, boots scuffing the gravel. A boy looked back once before his mother pulled him away by the hand. "She came to me 3 nights before she passed," Jim said finally. "Didn't want nothing, just asked one thing." Ellis sighed. "She asked you to go back in there?" "She asked me to find her boy," Jim replied. "Said he was playing near the clover, heard something. Said he saw someone in the upstairs window." He turned to face the preacher fully now. "Said the piano was playing. That hung in the air like a heat mirage." Ellis's face tightened. "That place has been boarded since the fire." "Since? I know when." Jim cut in. His voice wasn't sharp, but it carried weight. "I boarded it myself." They stood in silence, the wind stirring the dry grass around the gravestones. Ellis finally looked away, his voice gentler now. "Sometimes grief makes ghosts where there ain't none." "I ain't worried about ghosts," Jim said. "I'm worried about the living ones hiding where they don't belong." Later that evening, after most lights in town had dimmed, Jim sat alone on the edge of his porch. A bottle rested between his boots, untouched. His badge glinted faintly in the lamplight beside him, polished out of old habit. The piano had belonged to her, his daughter, built for small hands and fragile songs. After she died in the fire, no one dared touch it again. No one even spoke her name inside the clover. But now someone was touching it. He stood, slow and deliberate, pulled on his coat and holstered his sidearm. He didn't know what he'd find inside the saloon: answers, echoes, maybe nothing at all. But a debt was a debt. And something about the way the air had tasted at that grave told him the past wasn't done playing its tune. The night didn't start with music. It started with silence, a kind of silence that sinks into the bones, wide and flat like the prairie itself. Sheriff Hale had been walking the perimeter of town out of habit more than duty. Nothing ever stirred after sundown anymore, not unless it had reason to. Coyotes, maybe. A lonely dog or two. The wind, always. But people? People stayed inside after dark in Absolution. They knew better. Jim's boots crunched over loose stone and dry earth as he made his way past the general store. He paused for a moment, scanning the windows of the derelict buildings across the street, when he felt it, rather than heard it, like a tug behind the ribs. A low vibration, barely audible, brushing the edge of his hearing. He tilted his head. Then it came again. One piano note, middle register, faint, slightly off-key. Pressed down like a question no one wanted answered. He stopped walking. Turned. The rusted clover stood 2 blocks down, hunched and boarded like a crippled thing refusing to die. The wood along the facade was swollen from heat and age. The sign, half rotted, still swayed in the breeze, its metal brackets groaning in protest. That note had come from inside, he was sure of it. And then it came again. Another note, just one, same key. The sound was soft but unmistakable, not a breeze, not the creak of timber. It had weight. Intention. A finger had touched ivory. He crossed the street slowly, eyes narrowed, hand already near the revolver slung at his hip. No lights, no movement, no tracks in the dust leading to the front door. But the chain, he noticed it again, bent outward at an unnatural angle. Not broken, not cut. Pried. Like the building had exhaled someone recently. A third note. Closer now, then silence, then a fourth. Jim stepped onto the warped front steps, each one groaning like an old confession. The moment his boot touched the porch, the wind died. Everything hushed. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He just opened the door with the tip of his boot and stepped inside. Dust floated in the air like falling ash. The interior was a cathedral of ruin, everything draped in gray and still. The smell hit him first. Old smoke, dried whiskey, something fouler beneath. But the saloon was empty. Tables lay on their sides. A ceiling fan hung limp and rusted. And there, half in shadow, stood the piano. It looked wrong, smaller than he remembered, crooked. The lid was shut, but one key, just one, was slightly depressed. He stared at it. Then the note rang again. Jim flinched, breath catching in his throat. No one stood near it, no strings were pulled. It had moved on its own, or something unseen had touched it. The sound wasn't clean, it wavered, like it had passed through fog or memory before reaching him. And with it came something worse. A melody. Not full, not formed, but enough. A rhythm, a pattern. Just 3 notes now, in a row, the beginning of something unfinished. His throat tightened. It was the first line of "Sweet River Come," the hymn his daughter used to play on quiet mornings before school. She had loved that song. Played it slow, always slow, her small fingers pausing before each note like they were asking permission. His legs locked. He couldn't move. His breath grew shallow. The note sounded again, just that one. Pressed once, waited. Then again. Jim whispered to the dark, not sure whether in warning or plea, "You don't get to use her music." But the piano didn't stop. They found her the next morning, curled in the damp earth beneath the chapel, tucked behind rows of forgotten crates and jars of preserves no one had touched in years. It was the churchkeeper's wife who screamed first, then fainted straight onto the cellar steps when she saw the pale face in the shadows. Sheriff Hale was at the scene within minutes, holstering his revolver before he even reached the door. He could feel it already. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to be simple. She couldn't have been more than 9. Filthy, thin to the bone, barefoot, hair matted with straw and soot. She didn't cry, didn't flinch when he crouched beside her. Just stared up at him like an animal that had already accepted its cage. One arm clutched something tight to her chest, and when he moved closer, she pulled it tighter. A small wooden music box, cracked at the hinge, the winding key missing. A rose painted on the lid had been scratched through, as though someone had tried to erase it. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She said nothing. Behind him, the preacher and his wife watched nervously from the cellar door. "She won't speak," Ella said. "Hasn't made a sound, but she's not deaf. Looks right at you when you speak." Jim nodded once. He looked back at the girl. Her eyes were wide, glassy, almost feverish, but not from illness. From memory. He offered her a hand. She hesitated, then took it, fingers cold and stiff. He helped her up slowly, noticing the scratches along her arms, the torn hem of her dress. She'd come a long way through something rough. Brush, maybe. Or worse. They brought her upstairs, sat her near the hearth with a blanket and some bread. She didn't eat. Just held the music box in her lap, watching the door, always watching. As the light changed and the day wore on, she moved closer to the window, never looking out toward the fields, the churchyard, or the sky. Only toward the saloon. Each time Jim passed by the room, he saw it. Her eyes locked on the rusted clover, unblinking, terrified. By sunset, the girl hadn't moved for hours. Jim finally approached again, this time with an old oil lamp and a softened tone. He set it on the table beside her, sat down in the other chair, removed his hat. "I heard that box of yours playing last night," he said gently. "Or something like it." She blinked slowly, lips parting just slightly. A flicker of understanding or memory passed over her face, but she said nothing. "Did someone hurt you in there?" he asked. No reply. But her thumb began to stroke the box, back and forth, in slow, circular motions. It was the only movement she made for several minutes. Then, just as Jim stood to leave, she raised her head. Her eyes flicked up toward his, full of something ancient and broken. And she mouthed one word. Not a sound, not a whisper, just a shape on trembling lips. "Upstairs." Then she turned back to the window. And the music box, broken and unpowered, gave a faint click from her lap as if it remembered a song it hadn't finished. The next night, the wind died early. No thunder, no distant coyotes. Just a stillness that felt too deliberate, like the world was holding its breath. Sheriff Hale waited until the town lamps dimmed and the preacher's house went dark. He didn't bring a deputy, didn't leave a note. Just loaded his Colt with quiet hands and walked the narrow road to the rusted clover alone. The saloon stood like a half-collapsed memory, its front doors hanging slightly open as if expecting him. The lock chain lay limp on the floor, a dull curl of iron flecked with rust and something darker. He stepped inside, each bootfall soft in the hush, then louder as the wood underneath shifted with his weight. He closed the doors behind him without thinking. The darkness that followed was immediate and whole. He lit his lantern. The saloon came to life in low amber glow tables frozen mid-fall, a shattered mirror behind the bar catching the faint light and throwing it back in fractured glints. Dust coated everything, like frost on a grave except for one thing. The piano. It stood perfectly upright against the far wall, not a speck of dust on its lacquered surface. The keys gleamed bone-white. Hale approached slowly, the lantern raised. Someone had cleaned it, or had been playing it often enough that the dust never dared settle. He reached out, placed a single finger against a key, then paused. It was cold. Too cold. He didn't press it. Instead, he lowered the lantern and studied the floor. Dust there too, but broken, disturbed. Scuff marks in the filth where boots had dragged or turned sharply. Faint heel prints moving from the piano across the floor and toward the bar. He followed them. Behind the bar, a trapdoor lay flush with the wood, its handle aged but unbroken. He crouched, tested it, locked from underneath. Whatever was below, it didn't want company. But the prince didn't stop here. He rose, sweeping the lantern's light across the floor. More prints fresher now, leading to the narrow staircase in the back. The stairs twisted upward behind the far wall like a spine. Each step creaked underfoot as he climbed, gun drawn now, the air growing thinner the higher he rose. At the top, he found the door. Heavy. Weather-warped. Brass handle. Locked. He tried the knob once, then harder. No give. He leaned in, pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. Then, the faintest creak, like weight shifting slowly across floorboards on the other side. He knocked once. Silence. "Who's up here?" he called, low but firm. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, still nothing. He took a step back and glanced down. A thin line of soot snaked out from beneath the door, faint, recent, as though someone had lit a lamp or fire not long ago. He reached down and touched it. Warm. Then came a sound from behind the door, not the piano this time. Breathing, labored, shallow. He stepped back again, weapon raised. "You don't have to hide," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the lie in that comfort. "If you're wounded, I can help." Silence again. But as he turned to descend, the piano below struck a single note, clear, high, deliberate. The door behind him remained shut, the breath inside held. And beneath the floorboards, something shifted. By the next morning, the story had legs. It started in hushed tones over coffee pots and watering troughs. The preacher's wife had seen the girl. Said she came out of nowhere, eyes hollow as a burned-out chapel, clutching a broken box that ticked without winding. Then came the blacksmith's apprentice, who swore he saw the sheriff entering the rusted clover alone 2 nights in a row. Said Hale stayed hours, came back with dust in his teeth, and something else in his eyes, a kind of grief that stuck like ash. He'd been seen speaking to no one, pausing in the middle of the street, like he was listening to something the wind didn't carry. Whispers turned quick. They said Hale had lost his nerve. That the sheriff who once held off 5 riders at Black Rock without blinking, now wandered like a drunk between his office and a boarded-up ruin. Some said it was the girl. That she'd gotten inside his head. A mute child, emerging from nowhere, covered in dirt and silence, pointing at places she had no business knowing. And that music box of hers, the one that never played but made clicking sounds when no one touched it, someone swore it started spinning on its own near the chapel pews. Someone else claimed they saw her stare at the saloon windows and mouth something under her breath, and the piano answered. By sundown, the men who gathered on the porch of Jenkins' supply store weren't just swapping stories. They were choosing sides. "She ain't right," said Garrick, the tanner, eyes shaded by the brim of his cracked hat. "Things have been different since she showed up. The dog stopped barking at night. My boy's fever came back. I seen shadows movin' when there weren't no light." "You think she brought it with her?" someone asked. "I think something's inside her," Garrick answered, low and sure. "And Hale's letting it grow." On the other side of town, the saloon's boarded windows seemed to breathe with the day's heat. No one walked near it. Even the drunkards gave it space now. A stillness had wrapped itself around the place like a snake coiled in wait, invisible until it strikes. Inside the sheriff's office, Jim Hale sat with a half-drunk cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He stared at the music box, resting on the desk where the girl had left it that morning before disappearing again. It hadn't made a sound since. But she had drawn on the wood and charcoal 2 things, a staircase and a door with something black leaking from underneath. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't said a word about the breathing upstairs, or the piano that played without hands. But silence doesn't stop a rumor, it feeds it. Deputy Lyle stood in the doorway, jaw tight, arms crossed. "Town's talkin', Jim. They want answers. They want the girl gone." Jim didn't look up. "And what do you want?" Lyle hesitated. "I want to know if we're still keeping this town safe, or if we're protecting something we don't understand." That stuck. Because Jim didn't have an answer. Not one that wouldn't break something. Outside, the wind began to rise again. It carried no scent of rain, just dust, and tension, and a tune no one admitted hearing. By the second dusk since the girl's arrival, the mood in Absolution had soured into something brittle. Tempers ran short, eyes lingered longer than they should. Windows that used to stay open through the evening now shuttered at sunset. It wasn't just the saloon anymore. It was the feeling that something was leaking out of it, seeping into the ground, threading itself through the town like old blood beneath new paint. In the back of the feed store, where the light didn't reach and the dust hung thick, 7 men stood in a half-circle around a crate of loaded rifles. Garrick paced in front of them, shoulders tense, hat in his hand. He wasn't a preacher, but he spoke like one now, voice coiled tight with fear pretending to be certainty. "We've been quiet too long," he said, spitting on the floor between words. "Ever since the sheriff went soft, things have started crawling out of places they should have stayed buried." "Like that girl," muttered someone near the door. "Like that goddamn saloon," Garrick snapped. "You know what we used to hear in that place? Music, laughter, people livin'. Then came the fire and everything changed. Now we're hearing music again, but nobody's playin'. What's that tell you? No one answered. He grabbed one of the rifles, held it up like a torch in a cave. This town don't need ghosts. Don't need no cursed child hiding in our chapel. And it sure as hell don't need a sheriff who protects shadows. Lyle was there too, leaning in the corner, arms folded. He hadn't said much, not yet. But his silence wasn't the kind that meant agreement. It meant calculation. The others began arming themselves. Simple men, farmers, blacksmiths, men who'd buried sons and drank too much sense. Desperate men need an enemy, and Garrick gave them one. They stepped into the street at dusk, 7 of them at first, but by the time they passed the bakery and the schoolhouse, 3 more had joined. They moved with the certainty of purpose, the kind that turns suspicion into action. Rifles slung, lanterns in hand, eyes forward. And they marched toward the saloon. Inside the sheriff's office, Jim Hale stood by the window, watching the parade of resolution and ignorance move through the street like a river of dry fire. He could hear their boots, hear Garrick shouting something he didn't bother to make out. The sound was familiar. He'd heard it before, just before everything went wrong the first time. He turned back toward the desk. The girl sat on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slowly. She didn't speak. She never did. But her eyes followed the sound of boots like they'd been waiting for it. She raised the music box to her ear. Jim dropped his hand to his holster. "Stay here," he said. She didn't move. Outside, Garrick reached the steps of the saloon and stopped, breathing heavy. He raised his lantern, squinting up at the second-story window where no curtain had moved in years. The piano inside struck a single, sour note. They all froze. Then the door creaked open. Just a few inches, enough to show no one had touched it. And the air, for the first time that day, went cold. The hinges groaned as Hale forced the saloon doors shut behind him, pressing his full weight into the wood until they slammed tight. Dust shook loose from the upper beams like an exhale. The sound of the lock sliding into place echoed through the hollow of the building, followed by the scrape of a heavy beam he dragged from behind the bar and dropped across the entrance. He wasn't just closing the door. He was cutting the town off from something it didn't have the stomach to face. Outside, muffled voices rose in frustration, boots pacing, curses tossed at the closed doors like pebbles at a tomb. Hale ignored them. He moved fast, checking windows, hammering boards across any cracks wide enough for a barrel or a bullet. The lantern on the bar flickered as he passed, casting a trembling glow that struggled to keep pace with him. The girl was already inside, tucked into the booth nearest the piano. She hadn't followed him in. She'd been there. Somehow, when the first board was nailed. When the last voice faded, waiting. Like she knew the town would come, like she knew Hale would block the door before they did something stupid. She didn't look afraid. She looked resigned. Hale paused in the center of the room, breath loud in the silence. The piano stood untouched again, but he didn't go near it. Not yet. His eyes went to the staircase. Up there, the locked door, the breathing behind it, the warmth under the soot. He turned to the girl. "You knew they'd come." She didn't nod, didn't move. "You knew they'd come, and you still came back here." Still nothing. He stepped closer, crouching to her level. Her arms were wrapped around the music box, hands trembling just slightly. She didn't clutch it like a toy anymore. She cradled it like a warning. "Is someone up there?" he asked. She stared at him. "Someone hurt?" Still no response, just the faint, rhythmic rock of her knees against the bench seat, forward and back, forward and back. Her lips parted, barely. She mouthed something. He leaned in. "Say it again." She repeated it, slower this time, shaping each syllable carefully with her mouth. No sound, no breath, just form. But he couldn't read it. "God damn it," he whispered, standing up. "Tell me." Her eyes shifted not to him, but past him. To the piano. One key lowered. A soft, dead thump. No tone. He turned, gun half drawn, scanning the room. Empty, still. Only the girl breathing. Then he walked to the stairs. Each step creaked like a throat clearing in judgment. He placed his hand on the brass knob of the upstairs door, pressed gently. Still locked. Still warm beneath. He looked back down at the girl. "Who's up there?" he asked. Not to her now, not just. To the building, to the thing watching through the walls, to the silence itself. The piano played a chord full, heavy, like a question asked too late. And the girl finally blinked. Once. Upstairs, the breathing began again. The key struck itself again. Not softly, not by mistake. It rang out with purpose, crisp and defiant, echoing through the timber bones of the saloon like a bell tolling judgment. Hale's eyes locked on the piano as it began playing, not clumsily, not in fragments, but with a kind of terrible grace, as if an invisible player had finally remembered the tune in full. The melody unfurled slowly, precise and poised. A lullaby, almost, wrapped in minor chords that made the air grow colder. And no one sat at the bench. The girl stood still beside the old upright, the lantern light flickering against her face. Her mouth hung slightly open, but her expression wasn't shock anymore, it was resolve. She raised one thin arm and pointed, without a word, to the ceiling above them. Hale turned slowly, his back to the piano, which continued playing as if fueled by memory or ritual. The notes climbed as he climbed, matching the rhythm of his boots creaking up the staircase. Each board beneath his feet seemed thinner now, hollower, as though what lay above weighed more than the entire structure could carry. He reached the landing. The upstairs hallway stretched ahead, suffocating in shadow. At the end of it stood the door, heavy, still, waiting. The same one he'd stood before just nights ago, locked tight with breath behind it. Now it stood closed, but unlocked. And the air beyond it pulsed not with sound, but with pressure, like the heartbeat of a long-sealed wound. He turned back one last time. The girl below hadn't moved. But her lips were moving now, slow and soundless, mouthing something he couldn't read from here. Not a warning, not a prayer, a name maybe, or a confession. The music behind her swelled with rising intensity, no longer a song, but a summons. He stepped toward the door. The handle was cold, but it turned without resistance. The wood swung open just a crack, revealing only darkness. Not empty space, just a dark, so complete it pushed back against the light in his hand. His fingers flexed on the grip of his revolver. Another key was struck behind him. Then another. Then a full, climbing run across the board, a rising threat. Or invitation. The girl pointed again, jabbing her finger now. Urgent, afraid. He took a breath, shifted his stance, and threw the door wide. The lantern flared as he entered, casting brief, violent shadows across the walls, shapes that didn't match his own. The room was colder than death, and it smelled of smoke and lilacs and something older, something spoiled by time. A whisper moved through the air, not in words but in sound. The piano stopped. Then, a creak. From the far corner, Hale raised his weapon. "Show yourself," he barked. Nothing answered. Only the girl's music box below, ticking open by itself, playing a few hesitant notes in the same broken melody as the piano had moments ago. He took another step inside, toward the sound, toward the breath he knew wasn't his. And then the door behind him slammed shut. Cut to black. If someone you loved was hiding a truth this dangerous, would you protect them or expose them? The slam of the door echoed like a rifle crack in close quarters. Hale spun, gun up, shoulders tight, but the room behind him was empty. No movement, no wind. Just the walls breathing slow and cold, like lungs too long buried. The lantern's flame guttered against something unseen before settling again, casting dim halos that reached only part way into the corners. He stepped forward. The smell hit first old blood, rust, sweat soaked into cloth. Then he heard it. Not music. Breathing. Labored, shallow, close. He swept the lantern left. There, in the far corner, slumped against the peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards, was a figure half covered by a threadbare army blanket. A man. Gaunt, hair matted and wet against his forehead. Dried blood crusted along his temple, neck bristled with days-old stubble. His chest rose in uneven heaves, eyes fluttering behind cracked lids, mouth mumbling nonsense to the floor. Hale's pulse surged in his ears. The gun lowered an inch. Eli? The name tumbled from his throat before he could stop it. His voice sounded foreign in the room. The figure stirred, head lolling sideways, face turning toward the sound like it recognized something deeper than the word. Eyes opened, but not fully, not to clarity, clouded, lost. Jim. The man rasped. Not a question, a memory. Hale stepped closer, the lantern trembling in his grip. He dropped to a knee beside the man, hand out but unsure whether to touch him. "It's me," he said, voice catching. The eyes locked onto him now, clearer but wild. Get down, they're in the fire, Jim, they're inside the fire." The man convulsed, trying to rise, but collapsed with a groan. Hale gripped his shoulders gently, lowering him back. "You're safe, it's over." "Eli, it's me." His brother blinked rapidly, confusion and recognition battling behind a storm of heat and memories. You made it out," Eli whispered. "So did you." No, I didn't. Not all the way." His voice cracked on the last word, and he reached toward the air, grasping at something not there. They kept playing it, the hymn, over and over. When the smoke came, when they locked the doors, Hale felt the blood drain from his face. "Sweet River Come." It was the song their sister used to play when they were boys, long before either of them wore a badge or carried a rifle. It was the last thing anyone heard in the chapel that burned outside Lancer Ridge, the ambush that turned a battalion into a burial ground. Eli had been listed among the dead, his name etched on a plaque, but here he was, breathing, broken, buried not in dirt, but in memory. "You've been here since?" Hale asked. Eli laughed, short and bitter. "Sometimes I'm still in the fire. Sometimes I'm the one lighting it." The music box downstairs clicked once. Hale looked toward the floor, feeling the vibration climb up through the beams. "She found me," Eli whispered. "The girl brought the music back. But I can't stop it, Jim. I try. It just keeps playing." Hale gripped his brother's hand, firm now. "You're not alone anymore." But as he said it, the piano struck a single, sharp note below them, and Eli's eyes filled with dread. The next morning broke with no birdsong, no bells, no routine. Just dust on the wind and the whisper of something wrong, threading its way through Absolution's main street. The saloon doors remained shut, sealed tight with boards and bolts, but that did little to quiet the rising voices. It wasn't the music that haunted them now, it was the silence that followed. By noon, word had spread. The girl was still in town. And she wasn't alone. Someone no one could say exactly who let slip what they'd seen. A shadow in the upstairs window, a man's face where none should be, whispers from the chapel's back pew. The sheriff's brother, Eli Hale, long thought dead, now hiding like a ghost behind boarded windows. It took less than an hour for fear to turn to fury. By the time Sheriff Hale stepped out of his office, a crowd had gathered near the general store. Not a mob, not yet but close. Garrick was at the center, rifle strapped across his chest, sweat staining the collar of his shirt. His voice rang loud enough to draw even those who usually kept to themselves. The way he spat the words, it wasn't debate. It was declaration. "Deserters don't deserve sanctuary," he barked. "Not from us, not from him." Hale stood still, watching, jaw tight. He could feel the weight of every eye on him as he approached. Lyle stood to the side, arms crossed, not stopping the crowd, but not joining it either. Garrick turned to face Hale directly. "Is it true?" Jim didn't answer right away. "I asked you plain," Garrick pressed. "Is your brother up there?" "Eli Hale, the butcher of Lancer Ridge?" Hale's voice was low but steady. "My brother is a wounded man." "He's a traitor," Garrick snapped, stepping closer. "He ran when good men burned. You know what happened to my cousin? Burned alive inside that chapel while Eli ran for the hills. You think time erases that? He didn't run. Then why'd he hide?" Garrick's eyes were wide now, voice cracking under the pressure of old grief. "Why'd he crawl into that ghost house like a rat? Why didn't he come home like the rest of us who earned it?" "Because he couldn't face what you call home," Hale replied, voice rising only a fraction. "Because whatever happened out there, whatever orders were given, and broken, and buried, he was left to rot with them." That silenced the crowd for a moment, long enough for the weight of the words to settle. Then someone called out from the back, "We trusted you, Jim." Another followed, "You were supposed to protect us." Garrick leaned in. "So here at Island, we want him gone. You hand him over, or you and what's left of your name leave with him." Hale looked around, faces he knew, hands that had once built this town, now clenched into fists. He met Lyle's eyes across the crowd. The deputy didn't nod, didn't speak, just watched. "I won't give him to you," Hale said at last. Garrick smiled grimly. "Then start packing, Sheriff." And just like that, the title he'd carried for 12 years began to slip, not from law, but from the people who gave it meaning. The sky cracked open just past sundown, splitting wide with a sound like cannon fire. Rain poured down in sheets thick enough to blur the outlines of buildings, turning Absolution's dirt roads into dark veins of mud and memory. It was the kind of storm that didn't ask permission, just came down hard and fast, like judgment. Sheriff Jim Hale stood alone in the middle of Main Street, his coat soaked through, collar turned high against the wind. The badge that had once hung over his heart was gone, left behind on his desk in a silent gesture that no one had asked for but everyone understood. In its place, a simple brass button fastened his duster. He didn't need a symbol to stand his ground. Not tonight. The storm had driven most people indoors, but not the ones who mattered now. Lanterns bobbed in the dark like fireflies on the hunt, and soon they came into view, 6 of them at first, then 9, then 12. Men with rifles and pistols tucked under oilskins, faces tight with purpose. Garrick led them, his hat pulled low, rain dripping from the brim like sweat off a clenched jaw. Behind him, Lyle walked without a coat, arms stiff, hand never far from his belt. They stopped 30 paces from Hale. No one spoke at first, just the storm and the rattle of loose shutters. Thunder rolled again, low and mean. Hale didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to, not yet. He simply stood there, letting the rain wash the dust from his boots and the years from his eyes. In that moment, he didn't look like a lawman. He looked like something older. Garrick stepped forward. "You got one more chance," he called over the downpour. "Move aside." Hale's voice cut through the storm like a clean break. "You're not getting past me. This ain't about you anymore," Garrick shouted back. "That man in there, he's a deserter, a coward, a ghost in the shape of a man. You want to fall with him, that's your sin. He's my brother. And that's your mistake." They stared at each other, rain hammering down between them. Then Hale spoke again, quieter now, but every word carried. "You came here looking for justice, but all I see are men chasing revenge through the mud." "He ran," Garrick said, stepping closer. and men like that don't get to be forgiven. He didn't run from a fight, Hale said. He ran from what it turned him into. That gave some of the men pause. Even Lyle's jaw twitched. But Garrick raised his rifle anyway, leveling it at Hale's chest. Move. Hale didn't. He looked up at the black shape of the saloon, the windows dark, the upstairs holding its breath. If you shoot me, he said, I won't be the one haunting this town. For a moment, nothing moved. Not even the rain. Then lightning split the sky again, and a voice screamed from inside the saloon. Not the girls. Not Eli's. Something else. And suddenly, every man in that street remembered why they used to cross to the other side when they walked past the rusted clover. The silence after the scream was worse than the scream itself. It wasn't just quiet, it was hollow, like the world had blinked and forgotten to keep breathing. Rain hissed against the ground, steam rising from hot barrels and muddy boots. The posse stood frozen, rifles halfway raised, eyes flicking to the saloon like it might rise up and swallow them whole. Sheriff Hale didn't move. He stood in the center of the street, coat soaked through, hair plastered to his brow, the rain sliding down the lines in his face like it was trying to carve them deeper. He looked less like a man and more like a stone the storm couldn't wear down. His hand never went to his gun. His eyes never left theirs. Garrick's voice finally broke the silence. It was thinner now, stretched too tight. What the hell was that? No one you'd understand, Hale said, and no one I'm letting you blame. Garrick raised his rifle again, but slower now, the weight of it heavier than it had been a minute ago. You still think you're saving something in there? That thing upstairs, your brother, that's not someone you can fix. No, Hale said, stepping forward, boots sucking in the mud. I'm not here to fix him. I'm here to stop you from destroying what's left. You think he deserves mercy? I think he deserves to be seen as a man before he's judged as a myth. Garrick sneered, but his aim wavered. Around him, the other men shifted, their lines breaking. One lowered his weapon, then another. The tension that had drawn them like iron to a magnet was bleeding out, and all that remained was the raw weight of what they were about to do. Hale turned his voice up, not loud, but sharp, cutting through the rain like a blade. You all think you know what Courage Island. You think pointing a gun at someone broken makes you whole again. But let me ask you something. He stepped closer, closer still, until Garrick was staring down the barrel of a man who refused to bend. Who among you came back clean? Who among you didn't see something in the war that haunts your bed, your drink, your fists? No one answered. We all got ghosts, Hale said. But only some of us choose to bury them in bodies. The words landed like a hammer on wet stone. Garrick flinched, just barely. His finger hovered near the trigger, but his arms were trembling now. The rain wasn't washing his hate away, it was showing how thin the mask of righteousness really was. Behind Hale, the saloon stood silent again. The scream hadn't returned. The piano was quiet. But in the upstairs window, a faint light glowed a flicker, like a candle braving the wind. You think you're doing this for justice? Hale continued. Justice don't come from a rifle. Justice comes when a man faces the pain he caused, and still chooses to live. Lyle stepped forward now, slow and careful. He's right, the deputy said, voice steady. This isn't a lynching, and it's not a reckoning. Garrick looked at the men behind him. Most wouldn't meet his gaze. One by one, they backed away. The rifle dropped to his side. Hale let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Not relief, just release, the kind that comes after holding the line too long. No one cheered. No one thanked him. They just stood there in the rain, exposed and quiet, as the storm finally began to pass. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time she stepped out of the saloon. No one noticed her at first. The men were still scattered across the muddy street, shoulders slack, guns lowered but not forgotten. Garrick stood statue still, his rifle dangling in one hand like it had betrayed him. Hale remained at the center of it all, breathing hard through clenched teeth, his coat plastered to him like armor that refused to fall off. And then she appeared small, barefoot, and impossibly quiet. The girl descended the saloon steps without a sound, her thin dress clinging to her like soaked parchment. The music box was cradled to her chest, both hands wrapped tight around it, like it was the last truth she still trusted. Her hair stuck to her cheeks in wild strands. Her eyes swept over the men, each one, and didn't flinch. She walked toward Hale, toward the place where the town had drawn its line, and tried to pretend it was justice. She stopped beside him, looked up, and then, for the first time, she spoke. "He saved me." Her voice was small, scratchy, as if the words had to be carved out of something buried deep. But they rang louder than any rifle shot. Silence fell again, sharper this time. Every man's head turned. Lyle's brows drew in. Garrick blinked like he'd been slapped. The girl looked at them, at all of them. She didn't tremble. "They came at night," she said. "I was in the wagon with my mother. We were going south through the canyon pass. 3 men stopped us. They wore hats low and bandanas up. But I saw their eyes." She turned, her gaze locking on Garrick. Not with malice, with recognition. "You were there," she said. His jaw dropped. "What are you?" "You shot the horse first, then you set the wagon on fire." Her words didn't shake. They arrived cold and clean, like snowfall after smoke. "I was inside," she continued. "I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Then she turned to Hale, "Your brother. He pulled me out, carried me up the rocks. He had a wound in his leg. He bled the whole way, but he never let go." She held out the music box. The rain had left it warped and cracked, but still intact. "He gave me this," she said to keep it shut. That the song would be too much. No one moved. Garrick looked around, eyes darting, mouth trying to find shape. "That's a lie," he hissed. "She's lying." But no one backed him. Not this time. Lyle took a slow step forward. "She never said a word until now. Why would she lie?" "Because she's not right," Garrick said, his voice thinning. "She remembers," Hale said, voice low. "And she's telling the part none of us wanted to hear." The girl looked up at him again, and Hale saw it in her eyes, not fear, but something older, truth hard-earned. Trauma turned witness. "I didn't forget his face," she whispered. "I never will." And with that, the wind changed. The townsmen looked at Garrick now, not as a leader but as a question they weren't ready to answer. And Garrick, for the first time, looked small. The stillness didn't last. The girl's words had settled over the street like ash after a fire, soft, gray, clinging to everything. No one moved. Garrick stood pale, lips parted, as if trying to swallow a truth too large for his throat. Hale watched him with guarded eyes, one hand still resting on his sidearm, not out of fear, but readiness. The men behind Garrick, his makeshift posse, had begun to drift. One turned away, then another. Their rage had curdled into shame, and shame had no appetite for violence. Then came the hoofbeats. Slow at first, distant. A steady rhythm, wet hooves against soaked earth, echoing from the edge of town like a drum roll that had taken too long to arrive. They all turned. From the northern road came a rider cloaked in oilskin, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. His coat bore the unmistakable starburst of the federal marshals. A second horse followed close behind, riderless but burdened 2 saddlebags, a sealed trunk strapped tight, and something wrapped beneath canvas. The marshal dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the mud with a satisfying weight. He was tall, hollow-eyed, clean-shaven, with a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He nodded at no one, glanced at everyone, and made his way toward the saloon without asking permission. Hale stepped forward, hand lifting slightly. "Marshal." The man stopped. "Sheriff Hale," he replied, flat and official. "Not sheriff anymore." "That so?" The marshal glanced around at the men parting like reeds. "Looks like you still carry weight. What brings you here?" Hale asked, though a cold certainty had already begun to take root in his chest. The marshal unfastened a leather case from his coat and pulled out a folded document, sealed with wax. "Federal order. I'm here to apprehend Eli Hale, former corporal, 2nd Division, presumed dead but now very much alive. Charges: desertion under fire, dereliction of duty, and obstruction of federal investigation." The crowd shifted again. Garrick straightened, emboldened for a half-second before remembering the accusation still hanging in the air. Hale took the document but didn't break the seal. "He's wounded, delirious. Barely knows where he island." "Doesn't matter," the marshal said. "He's a federal matter now." The girl stepped closer, wary. She clutched her music box tighter, eyes fixed on the marshal. Then the man reached into the second saddlebag and retrieved another pouch, this one stamped with a different seal: military intelligence. "I have something else," he said, voice lower now. "Documents recovered from a destroyed convoy. Took years to unearth and declassify." He handed Hale the bundle. "Figured someone ought to know before things get uglier." Hale opened the flap. Inside were pages, some typed, others handwritten. Field logs, supply manifests, recon reports. And at the top, a name he hadn't seen in years. Garrick's. Not once. Repeated. Attached to requisitions, signatures, map coordinates, scout routes, memos from the days before Lancer Ridge went silent, before the fire, before Eli vanished. Hale looked up, eyes cold now. "You led them into it." Garrick froze. I filed those under orders." The marshal interrupted. "Orders changed. He didn't. Men died for it." The tension surged back, different now. Not anger. Exposure. "Your brother didn't desert," the marshal added. "He tried to stop the ambush." And just like that, the ghosts changed direction. The girl had remained silent through the storm of accusations and revelations, her small frame still as stone beside the saloon steps. But her grip never left the music box. Not once. Not when Garrick's name was spoken. Not when the marshal handed over the sealed files. Not even when the townsfolk started looking at each other differently, suspicion curving inwards now, not out. It was the marshal who noticed her watching. He turned toward her, gaze narrowing. "That box," he said, voice softer than it had been all day. "Where'd you get it?" The girl looked to Hale before she answered. "From him," she whispered. "From Eli." The marshal stepped forward, boots sucking in the mud. "May I?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she held it out. Hale stepped between them, gently intercepting the handoff. He took the box from her, turning it over in his palms. It was small, no bigger than a man's fist. A rose, painted on the lid, had faded to a ghostly outline. The winding key was still missing, but when he shook it lightly, something inside shifted, not the delicate rattle of gears. Something harder, denser. He met the marshal's eyes. "You said those files were recovered from a burned convoy?" The marshal nodded. Hale opened the box. The false bottom was subtle, barely a lip at the seam, but there. He slipped the tip of his knife into the edge and pried it up. The wood gave way with a soft crack. Inside lay a strip of folded canvas, brittle with age. He drew it out carefully, fingers trembling, and unrolled it across the saloon's porch rail. It was a map. No, the map. He recognized it immediately. Canyon ridges, dry creeks. The trade routes between Lancer Ridge and the southern mines. But this one had marks, lines, symbols, and a series of tiny, careful numbers written in the margins: coordinates, gold runs, smuggling paths. places where military protection had been pulled just hours before each ambush. The exact coordinates matched those in the files the marshal had handed over. One in particular had a name beside it, in a different hand, sloppier, scrawled like an afterthought. Hale's own. He stepped back, breath caught in his throat. He remembered now. One night, weeks before the massacre, a supply officer had come to him after a poker game half drunk, asking about patrol gaps near the South Gulch. Just hypotheticals, he'd said. A what if? Hale had answered offhandedly, not thinking twice. Those answers ended up here. In that map. In those deaths. He hadn't known. Not fully. But he hadn't asked either. Behind him, Garrick's voice cracked. You can't prove. I don't need to, the marshal said. It's all here. Every name, every pullback, every lie. The townsmen had gone quiet. Several stepped away from Garrick. One dropped his rifle in the mud. Hale stared down at the map, the coordinates seared into his mind now, like burns that would never fade. The girl touched his hand gently. He gave it to me, she said. So someone would remember. And now, finally, they did. The town council convened beneath the warped beams of the old meeting hall, the very heart of Absolution, a place that once decided fence lines and water shares now pressed into bearing the weight of something darker. The rain had stopped, but the storm lingered in the air, thick and metallic, like the breath before a gunshot. The room was packed, though no one spoke above a whisper. Most of the townsfolk sat stiffly on the pew-like benches, backs straight, eyes darting to one another in suspicion or shame. A few stood at the rear, arms crossed, faces unreadable, as though withholding judgment, not out of mercy, but habit. In the center, a long table stood with 4 chairs behind it, occupied by the town's elder voices. Preacher Ellis, shopkeep Mara Teams, millwright Jonah Price, and old Harlan Birch, who hadn't smiled since the rail moved west. Sheriff Hale, former sheriff, by their reckoning stood alone before them. The girl beside him, her small hand clutching his like it was the only thing holding her upright. The music box sat closed on the table. The folded map, now sealed in a clear envelope by the marshal, lay beside it. Garrick stood off to the side, pale and tight-jawed, 2 of his own former allies keeping a wary distance. Hale's voice, when he began, didn't try to be commanding. It was raw, scraped, measured not in volume, but in weight. There's more than enough blood on all our hands, he said, mine included. He paused, letting the silence dig into them. I should have asked more questions, should have read between the lines. Instead, I let my guilt convince me ignorance was mercy. He looked at the council. The man you almost dragged from that saloon he didn't desert. He was left behind, punished for trying to stop what this town helped make happen. He opened the music box, gently. It didn't play. It didn't need to. Those coordinates, he gestured to the map. They link back to every ambush between Lancer Ridge and the southern routes. Supply drops, smuggling trails, even bodies. You'll find Garrick's name on half the sign-offs, mine on one. A murmur moved through the room like wind under a door. Preacher Ellis cleared his throat. And what would you have us do, Jim? Turn on our own? On the men who built this town? Hale's voice sharpened. We already did. We turned on what we were supposed to be. Mara Teams leaned forward. What does justice look like now? He didn't answer. He let the question hang there, because it wasn't his to decide anymore. Votes were cast. One by one, hands raised, some trembling, others too fast. The count split down the middle, until old Harlan Birch, who hadn't spoken a word in 2 years, cleared his throat. I remember the fire at Ridge, he said. My boy didn't come back from it. Garrick said it was God's will. But God don't need signatures. He raised his hand. The final vote. Judgment. Garrick was stripped of his militia title, his weapons confiscated. Not imprisoned, Hale had insisted. We don't need martyrs, we need mirrors. The saloon was closed that night, not with chains or nails, but with quiet. Hale walked the girl back inside one last time. She sat at the piano, opened the lid, and pressed one key. It didn't play. Not broken, just still. She smiled. And the silence, for once, felt clean. Months passed, and the town slowly learned to breathe again. The rusted clover remained standing, though no one drank there, no laughter echoed off its warped beams, and no cards were dealt on its dusty tables. The bottles behind the bar stayed corked, thick with dust and memory. But the door no longer creaked with dread, and the windows were no longer nailed shut. It was no longer a wound, just a scar. Inside, the piano sat quiet most days, but not forgotten. Sheriff Hale, though few called him that anymore, came by often. Sometimes just to sit, sometimes to run a cloth over the keys. Sometimes to fix a loose board or oil the hinges on the front door, which now swung open to no threat at all. He always came alone. Except when she was with him. The girl had no name she'd given, and no one pushed her to offer one. She lived with Preacher Ellis and his wife now, helping around the church, drawing chalk shapes in the dust behind the altar, or sitting for hours near the graveyard fence with the wind in her hair. She spoke more now, quietly, carefully. But her words came soft as rainfall. They didn't need to be loud. And she played. It began one afternoon. The doors of the saloon stood open, sun pouring through the cracks, illuminating the long-dead floorboards like pages being turned. Hale had placed her on the piano bench, gently, like seating a fragile truth. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling, unsure. He stood beside her, his hand on the back of the bench. "Try C," he said. She pressed the key. A clear, clean note rang out. Then she smiled. Each day after, they returned. A few minutes at first, then longer. Hale taught her scales, simple melodies, the roots of songs that once held meaning before they became echoes of pain. She learned fast, and when she made mistakes, she didn't frown, she listened. Then tried again. The music grew fuller with each visit, slowly piecing itself back into something whole. Eli never returned to town. The marshal took him north, not to a cell, but to a medical post, where men who'd survived war but not memory, were given quiet rooms and time no one else had offered. The last letter Hale received from him was short. Tell her the song helped. Tell her she gave it back. One late afternoon, as golden light poured through the high saloon windows and dust motes danced like ghosts made gentle, the girl sat at the piano and began to play a tune that Hale hadn't heard since before the fire. Sweet River Come. But this time, it wasn't broken. It was whole, slower, more delicate. She added pauses in new places. She gave it breath. Hale stood near the wall beside the stairs. In his hand was the badge. It hadn't meant much lately, not after everything. But it wasn't for power anymore, it was for closure. He placed it on a nail above the bar, quiet as a prayer, and stepped back. The music continued behind him, rising and falling like wind over water. He didn't need the title, not anymore. He had the song. And that was enough. What if the law wasn't about order but about mercy? In the next story, someone will have to choose.